Welcome to the Healing and CPTSD Show, a space dedicated to supporting complex trauma survivors through community, resources, and advocacy. Absolutely. And this book, which comes out in September, I was very blessed to get to read it first. I love it. It really, I've always said that it feels like this culture is just swiping trauma under a rug and ignoring it. And I felt like you validated that completely in this book, every part of it. How was it writing the book with your son? Was it kind of therapeutic in a way, as you did pass down trauma to him and now you both are getting to write this book together? Was it therapeutic in a way?
It turned out that way. Daniel and I do a program together called Hello Again, a fresh start for adult children and their parents. And that's actually going to be our next book.
Oh, okay.
So we've had our challenges in our relationship.
Yeah.
And first of all, writing the book was hard because it was such a big topic. And even though I wrote in four previous books, published, 30 languages, this time I really lost my confidence that I could do it. That I thought maybe this time I bit off more than I can chew. And at that time, at certain times, I was in quite a state. So Daniel helped to stabilize me that way. And also he's so good with words that this is the first time that I've really used somebody to help me shape my chapters and so on. I wrote most of it. But the finesse and the finish and the formulation, and sometimes even the introduction or the beginnings to chapters, really relied on his brilliance with words. In terms of our relationship, we got very tense at times, really difficult at times. By the end, we had a very respectful, mutually collaborative, very effective collaboration. So the book was therapeutic in that sense. It didn't begin that way because but you see what would happen is I'd get uptight at times. Now
That's fair.
Some of Daniel's trauma is that he had a parent who was very uptight at times. So then my uptightness about how it was going and my tenseness and my terseness and my irritability would then trigger his stuff. So it was quite the process.
Yeah, it sounds it, but it's beautifully written and I know going to be very successful, and you must have enjoyed it to a point if you guys are now writing another book together.
Well, we decided to write the two books, right? We have a 2-book contract, so this is the first.
Okay.
But you know what? It was enjoyable. It was satisfying. It was very fulfilling and a great joy. And as he says in his acknowledgement at the end of the book, he says, "I'm so glad," he says, "that I finally get to put words in your mouth."
Oh, I love that. I love that. That's good. So in your book, and you discuss early on about some of your early experiences, and we just touched on this a little bit about how parents are raising children based on ways that don't work for children, right? Like the cry it out scenario with the babies, right? And there was the part of the book that you're talking about this that discussed how when you were a baby and you had like a sore throat or an earache, and pardon me if I have it.
So,
and that you didn't cry. Do you want to elaborate a little bit on that?
Sure. So so let me jump towards the end of the book, right?
Okay.
The second to last chapter, I talk about the third to last chapter. It's a chapter on psychedelics.
Yes.
And I talk about how these shamans in Peru picked up on the fact that I had a big scare in early childhood and I haven't got over it yet. This is 3 years ago.
Wow.
When I'm 76 of age. And so that's it. That's in that 30th chapter. In the first chapter, I talk about coming back from a speaking trip and my wife not picking me up at the airport, forgetting that and I freak out like I was being abandoned. Now, which has to do with the fact that my mother did abandon me when I was 1 year old. not abandoned me. She gave me to a stranger, and I didn't see her for 6 weeks or 5 weeks. But that was to save my life under the conditions of Nazi occupation in Budapest. But I experienced it as an abandonment, and even decades later, um, she's not at the airport. Oh, I'm an abandoned infant. So that trauma leaves this imprint. So one way that we traumatize our kids is we just pass on our own traumas, you know. So I wasn't as present for my kids as they needed me to be. But in terms of that earache incident, forget the Nazis and forget the war. Just my mother and I in the hospital when I'm 2 weeks of age and we're still in the maternity ward. And she writes in her diary, she kept a diary, which I have. And she writes, my poor little Gabor, my heart is breaking for you because you've been crying for an hour and a half to be fed. But I promised the doctor that I wouldn't feed you except every 4 hours, and it's not time yet. No, forget the Nazis, forget the war, just a mom whose heart is screaming to pick up her baby, which any animal would do, by the way, cat or a baboon or a dog, you know. But because she's been told by the expert only to feed me on demand, on schedule, she's not picking me up. What message do I get? Is that I don't matter and that my feelings don't matter and that I'm all alone. And so same thing happens when kids cry to be picked up at night and we don't because experts tell us to sleep train them. No, you tell a mother baboon to sleep train their baby or a mother bear to sleep train their baby or tell any Aboriginal indigenous human being who carry their babies everywhere they go. They don't even put them down. Never mind not pick them up when they're crying. When the baby's crying, because they want contact, because they need contact. They actually need that contact, not just to be fed. They just need contact. Now, when a child doesn't get that, number of things happen. One is their brain gets flooded with cortisol. That interferes with brain development. The child will go back to sleep because they'll give up. But what have they learned? They've learned that they're all alone, no point asking for help. So they become good little babies. They don't cry. 5 years later, I'm lying in my bed in Budapest with a severe stabbing earache because of the ear infection. I'm not calling my parents, 5 a.m, and I'm whimpering to myself quietly not to wake them up because I became a good little baby. Now, the most natural thing in the world is for a child in pain or a child in danger is to run and ask for help from the parent. So when we ignore kids' cries, what we're doing to them is we're teaching them that their pain doesn't matter, that they're all alone, you know. And I give an example of this when it comes to the trauma in politics. You know, Hillary Clinton, when she was nominated for presidency of the United States, there was a movie about her life that was shown at the Democratic Convention that was seen by multiple millions of people on television, and it was narrated by Morgan Freeman. And the story was that when Hillary was 4 years old, no, this was taught as an example of wonderful resilience building parenting. And the story is that Hillary, 4 years old, runs into her home because neighborhood kids are bullying her, and she runs to her mom for protection. And the mother says, "There's no room for cowards in this house. Now you get out and deal with it." Now that's a child being traumatized. This story is told on television in front of millions of people. Nobody commented on it. That what was being done here is the celebration of child trauma. And what's the lesson? Suck it up. You're on your own. Be hard and suck it up. And you're on your own. 60 years later, she gets pneumonia. What does she do? The middle of the campaign, she doesn't tell anybody. She gets dehydrated. She's feverish. And she's carrying on like there's nothing wrong. And she collapses in the street. And this is how normal trauma is.
100%.
I didn't see a single comment on this tragedy.
It's very heartbreaking, and I'm so thankful that you shared that in the book, because if it's okay with you, I'd love to share a personal scenario with me that relates with this.
No, please do.
Okay. So when I come from an alcoholic family and mental illness, intergenerational trauma, the whole shebang. And when I was about 2 years old, I broke both of my collarbones.
Wow.
And, the story that was told was that I rode my dog down a flight of stairs and was a very wild child, which growing up, once I was an adult, I realized that was like a cover-up story and I'll never know the truth. But the part that really got me was that what I was told, because of course I don't remember it, what I was told the whole time was, yeah, you broke both your collarbones, but you were so strong, you didn't cry. We didn't even take you to the hospital for 2 weeks. So I had 2 broken collarbones and I had the bumps on them because they didn't take me. 2 broken collarbones and I didn't cry
Yeah.
for 2 weeks and
Yeah.
just sat with it because that's how much chaos and danger was going on in the
Yeah.
home that it
Yeah.
didn't feel like I could, right?
That's
And
right.
it reading it and having it was the first time that I was like, I knew that wasn't normal.
Yeah.
I knew that didn't make sense. And what was I internalizing? The story that I was told, you were so strong, you didn't cry. So in
Yeah.
my head, if you cry, you're weak. Don't cry, you got to be strong, right?
Oh my.
And it just meant so much to me to read your story and even Hillary's story as well. And I was like, that makes sense. That wasn't normal.
Yeah. Well, imagine not just how much physical pain you must have been in, but just what does it feel like for a 2-year-old to be alone with that pain?
Right?
Any 2-year-old, you know?
Yeah. So just so intense, you know what I mean? And of course I
Yeah.
don't remember it. And of
Yeah.
course, but it's clearly impacted me and it's clearly something that I still deal with. So for other people, right? Other people in the community and myself, and even you who's experienced something at such a young age that's so traumatic, how do you deal with that trauma when you don't have the memory of it and maybe you don't know exactly what happened the first few years, but you know something happened? What can we share with the community on how to deal with that?
Well, first of all, we have to talk about what memory is.
Mm,
Because you say you don't remember it, but I say you do remember it. You just don't recall it. You just don't recall it.
good one. Yes.
There's what we call explicit memory, which is the recall.
Mhm.
Now, recall memory doesn't come online till probably after 2 years of age.
Mm,
Most people don't recall much at 2 or before,
yeah.
because the structure in the brain
Mhm.
that recalls episodes, the hippocampus, isn't developed yet. It starts developing at 18 months. But there's another kind of memory, which is emotional memory,
Mm,
which is body memory, which is what we call implicit memory. It's not explicit, it's not overt, it's not recall,
right.
but the body remembers. So when you say, even to this day, you have a tendency, that's what I heard you say, that even to this day, you have a tendency to kind of hide your pain.
Mhm.
That's the memory.
Right. 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 I
So
don't have the memory of it happening, but my body remembers.
yeah, that's the whole point. So
Yeah.
that there's no recall, but there's memory. And so
Mm,
that very often, that's exactly what trauma does. Is
mhm.
it, one of my colleagues and teachers, Peter Levine, calls trauma the tyranny of the past.
Mm,
So we keep acting out of these past-based dynamics, such as you being heroic with your pain, even if there's no recall for the incident, but the memory is in your body and it still controls you. Not probably as much as it used to, but the
now that
tendency,
I'm aware, yeah.
so whenever that shows up,
Mhm.
you can recognize it as a memory, even if you have no recall,
Right. Right.
even
So
if you have no recall.
how would how how can we help the community know on how to deal with that when it happens? Whether if you have something directing you want to go that way, or if we want to start talking about triggers, up to you. I'll let you lead that right now. But how can we help the community for people who have a lot of trauma in those early years, and they might not remember it, but their body certainly does.
Yeah.
What do
Well,
we do?
let's look at triggers. So
Yeah.
one of the best way to identify your trauma is through the triggers. Okay.
Mhm.
So I already referred to this in my case. I arrived back in Vancouver from this speaking trip, and my wife, being an artist, lost herself in the middle of the flow of creating some painting, and therefore she doesn't get there, and she texts me saying, "I haven't left home yet. Do you still want me to come?" And I go into a rage, and when I get home, I don't even look at her for a day.
Yeah.
Well, what, at age 71 or 2, I can't handle that my wife forgot because she was painting. I've only known her for 50 years, for God's sakes. I mean,
Yeah.
you know, so that's a memory of how an infant responds to abandonment by mother.
Right.
So when we get triggered, that's always the memory.
Yeah.
Now, and a word about triggers, like these days, there's all these trigger warnings and you triggered me. And I say, if I triggered you, not that I meant to,
Mhm.
but that's good.
Mm.
And I tell you why it's good.
Yeah.
Not because it's pleasant. It's not pleasant. But
Mhm.
when you think of the trigger, it's a metaphor, isn't it? Well, the metaphor refers to weaponry.
Mhm.
Now, how big a part of the weapon is the trigger?
Tiny.
Tiny little part.
Yeah.
For the trigger to set anything off, there's to be ammunition there. There's to be explosive charge.
Mhm.
There's to be a whole mechanism there.
Mhm.
It's much more interesting to look at what is your explosive charge than what the trigger was.
Yeah.
When we concentrate on the trigger, we're just looking at the outside. But that's not where the healing happens,
Mm-mm.
because the trauma happened inside ourselves. That explosive charge that's set off when somebody triggers you, that's your trauma showing up.
Yeah.
Now you can deal with it. Like, if somebody agrees to have coffee with you and they don't show up, you can be disappointed.
Mhm.
You might decide to call them and give them a very stern talking to, saying, I don't want you to do this to me.
Right.
But if you get triggered and you go into a rage and I'm being abandoned, and I feel abandoned and I feel rejected. Abandoned and rejected are not feelings.
Mm.
They're perceptions.
Mm. Deep.
They're perceptions. When you have that perception, you feel hurt and you
Mhm.
feel rage.
Mhm.
But given that somebody not showing up for coffee hardly amounts to a life issue,
Right.
you can ask yourself, well, when did I first perceive that I was abandoned and rejected?
Mm.
So that's the ammunition, that's the explosive charge.
Right.
If I had never been abandoned or rejected, or I never perceived that I was,
Mhm.
my mother had never given me to that stranger to save my life.
Right.
When my wife didn't show up at the airport, I might have been disappointed.
Mhm.
I might have called to say, hey, what's going on? You said you'd be here. Okay,
Right.
I'll take a taxi home. I'll talk to you in 20 minutes.
Right.
But the triggering didn't have anything to do with what she did. It had to do with the explosive charge around the sense of abandonment
Mhm.
that even 7, 8 years ago was
Yeah.
very active in my subconscious.
Yeah. And so really triggers are just an opportunity to get curious about what's happening inside.
That's the whole point.
Yeah. Yeah.
So the method that I've developed, it's called compassionate curiosity, or compassionate inquiry.
Mhm.
Yeah, which is all about inquiring. Okay, so Eckhart Tolle said it once. If you know him, the spiritual teacher, he said, "Be at least as interested um, in your reactions to situations than in the people or situations that triggered those reactions,
Mhm.
because the learning and the healing is in looking at your own reactions."
Mhm.
Now, that doesn't mean that we put up with being badly treated. No, we set a boundary, but it does mean that in the ordinary course of life, when we get triggered,
Mhm.
and then 10 minutes later or a day later, we realize, oh boy, that was over the top on my part.
Yeah.
It's always trauma showing up,
Yeah.
and it's a time, as you say, to get curious.
Yeah. So, you said that this happened a few years ago. Would you say that now, if that situation were to happen again, would you have the same response? Do you think that you would deal with it differently?
Yeah, I would actually, thank God. I mean, even then, after 24 hours of the silent treatment, of the hostile silent treatment, when my wife Ray said, knock it off already, I did knock it off, which means that years before it would have taken me days or weeks, So
Right.
even that was progress. But
Right.
now I might feel some irritation. I might not feel anything. I just,
Right.
but I would not go into this withdrawal and silent hostility,
Yeah.
which is the response of the infant. I wouldn't, that doesn't happen anymore. Well, thank God, because she wouldn't put up with me anymore if it did.
There's